Thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the privilege, Father Gruner, of attending this conference, which, year after year, is a manifestation of what persistence in the cause of what is good and what is just and what is true and what is holy can produce. Because as we stand here today, the entire Fatima landscape has been changed from what it was only 5 or 6 years ago. And the position that we've adopted is no longer the position of Fatimites with tinfoil hats with the word Fatima emblazoned on them, but people whose position now has earned a certain degree of respect and acceptance, certainly here in Italy among the Italian press in general, and throughout the world, I would say. And the Pope himself, as we will see during my talk, has reopened the dossier on Fatima, as Antonio Socci has put it. At Father Gruner's suggestion, I wrote a book. It's essentially, in part, a compendium of things I've written before about this question of the false friends of Fatima, but there's new material in it as well to weave it together into a thematic presentation of this whole idea of people who pay tribute to the Fatima message while they undermine it. Let me give you the context for this discussion as presented in the book. There are two parties in the church today. The entire church has been divided basically into two parties. One, identified by Pope Pius XII, as we will see, can be called the party of the innovators. And these people, whatever their intentions, whatever their motives, whether they're culpable before God or not, is not for me to say, have produced a vast transformation of the Catholic Church in her liturgy, the expression of her theology, and in her relations with the world, particularly in relations with other religions and with communist countries, the policy toward which has been governed by something called Ostpolitik, or the politics of the East, which is essentially a policy of accommodating atheistic and communistic regimes, avoiding any antagonism toward these regimes, conciliating them in the hope of obtaining concessions from them, and certainly not confronting them in any religious sense, in any sense of the church militant of old. And in the post-Vatican II church, this party of the innovators finds itself arrayed against the party that I call in the book, for lack of a better word, the party of the traditionalists. And what is a traditionalist? A traditionalist is a Catholic who simply went on being what Catholics always were before the Council, who holds to the traditional liturgy of the Church, the traditional expressions of her dogmas, and the traditional devotions and practices. He's a Catholic who lives as if the earthquake following the Second Vatican Council didn't happen, and I think this Pope has made it quite clear that we're entitled to practice and live our faith the way it always was before the Council, that the Council has not in fact changed anything. So you have these two parties, the party of the innovators versus the party of the traditionalists. And the party of the innovators have provoked a total disaster in the Catholic Church. And our Pope himself has made that clear. In his homily just before he was elected Pope, the former Cardinal Ratzinger put it this way: how many winds of doctrine have we known in recent decades? How many ideological currents? How many ways of thinking? The thought of many Christians has often been tossed about by these waves, flung from one extreme to another, from Marxism to liberalism, even to libertarianism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to a vague religious mysticism, from agnosticism to syncretism, and so forth. And then he says something quite shocking, because it pertains to our church. And it's amazing that this should happen in the Holy Catholic Church. Today, the Pope said, having a clear faith based on the creed of the Church is often labeled as fundamentalism, whereas relativism, that is, letting oneself be tossed here and there, carried about by every wind of doctrine, seems the only attitude that can cope with modern times. What an indictment that is of the state of the Church today, uttered by the man who, literally historical moments later, would become the currently reigning Roman pontiff. Now, Paul VI made a similar admission, much more dramatically. We've all heard a fragment of this statement about the smoke of Satan entering the church. But here is the full statement in his Insegnamenti, Volume 10, 1972, page 707. This is the Roman pontiff, not people wearing tinfoil hats with the word Fatima on them, speaking about the state of the church immediately after the council. By some fissure, he said, the smoke of Satan has entered into the temple of God. There is doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest. Doubt has entered our consciences, and it has entered through the windows which were meant to have been opened to the light. This state of uncertainty reigns even in the church. It was thought that after the council there would be a day of sunlight in the history of the church. Instead, there came a day of clouds, of darkness, of groping, of uncertainty. How did this happen, the Pope asks? And his answer, we will confide our thoughts to you. There has been an interference from an adverse power. His name is the devil. Nothing that we traditionalists have said can match that for sheer drama. That is an admission of an absolutely apocalyptic state of affairs in the church. Let no one accuse us of being extremists. We simply point to the diagnosis of Paul VI. Now, in every age, God sends prophets to his church, especially in times of crisis. St. Thomas puts it this way in the Summa Theologica. And I'm quoting St. Thomas. The prophets who foretold the coming of Christ could not continue further than John, who with his finger pointed to Christ actually present. Nevertheless, as St. Jerome says on this passage, this does not mean that there were no more prophets after John. For we read in the Acts of the Apostles that Agabus and the four maidens, daughters of Philip, prophesied. At all times, says St. Thomas, there have not been lacking persons having the spirit of prophecy, not indeed for the declaration of any new doctrine of faith, but for the direction of human acts. In other words, God sends prophets in every age throughout the salvation history, especially in times of crisis, to tell us what to do to avert or to mitigate that crisis. And the greatest of the prophets that God has ever sent in the history of the church is Our Lady of Fatima, by virtue of her being nothing less than the Mother of God. She is the ultimate admonitory prophet for the church. And of course, she gave us her prophecy, her revelation, which is a reflection, as Father Gruner says, of the gospel itself, at Fatima. And we've heard it said that this is a private revelation. I won't go a step further with this talk until I dispose of that nonsensical objection. God did not provide a private revelation for 70,000 of his closest friends in the field at Cova de Iria. He provided to those 70,000 and for the world to see, and as the New York Times reported, and as Warner Brothers mentioned in a movie which was devoted to this miracle, an incredible event involving the details of which we all know. The sun plummeted to the earth, spun in the sky, changed colors, altered the landscape, dried the soaking witnesses instantaneously, provoked cures and conversions and so forth, and was seen miles distant from the cova. And Pope after Pope has attested to the authority of the revelation as worthy of belief, and indeed a revelation, a message of the Mother of God. And John Paul II has added it to the calendar of the Roman liturgy. The Feast of Our Lady of Fatima is now an official part of the Roman liturgy. Cannot ask for a higher papal approbation of a Fatima apparition. Now, the apparition, which is no private revelation, but as Father Gruner has said, a public prophetic revelation tied to the gospel, is both a warning and a prescription. And the warning is twofold. The warning concerns a crisis in the church, and a crisis in the world. And as I show in the book, and as I've noted elsewhere, Pius XII noted the crisis in the church as an element of this warning precisely in reference to the message of Fatima, when he said, and I'm quoting, "I am worried by the Blessed Virgin's messages to little Lucia of Fatima. This persistence of Mary about the dangers which menace the church is a divine warning against the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul." Remember, I mentioned a moment ago the party of the innovators. Here's what Pius XII said: "I hear all around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the church, reject her ornaments, and make her feel remorse for her historical past. A day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the church will doubt as Peter doubted." That's what the future Pope said. Just as dramatic, perhaps even more dramatic than what Paul VI said. And he said it in light of the message of Fatima. So we're talking about a twofold crisis in the world and in the church. And Benedict XVI, speaking precisely of the third secret, reopened the file, as I said at the beginning of the talk, and as Antonio Socci has said, when during his pilgrimage to Fatima, he let it be known that the third secret indicates not events in the past, but, and I'm quoting, "future realities of the church, which are little by little developing and revealing themselves." In 2010, he said that. Revealing themselves now and little by little developing themselves. Thus it is true that beyond the moment indicated in the vision, it is spoken, he said. The vision speaks of nothing. It is spoken, it is seen the necessity of a passion of the church that naturally is reflected in the person of the Pope, and therefore the sufferings of the church are what is announced. And then he revealed that attacks on the Pope and the church do not come only from the outside, but the sufferings of the church come precisely from within the church. This has always been known, but today we see it in a really terrifying way, that the greatest persecution of the church does not come from enemies outside, but arises from sin in the church. And ladies and gentlemen, absolutely none of that is seen in the vision published in 2000. Clearly, there's some explanation of that vision by which the Virgin Mary herself ties the apocalyptic scene in that vision to what Paul VI remarked, to what Pius XII remarked, to what Benedict XVI has indicated, an internal crisis in the church brought about by internal enemies in the church. Nothing in the vision about this. Surely there is an explanatory text which shows that the apocalyptic scene in that vision follows a crisis in the church and is tied to it, for as the church goes, so goes the world. Now, that brings us to the false friends of Fatima. The message of Fatima in its traditional Catholic sense is completely unacceptable to this party of the innovators, whose auto-demolition of the church was foreseen by Pius XII, who referred precisely to innovators. But they cannot attack the message of Fatima directly. It has too much weight behind it. It has the approbation of pope after pope. It was vouched for by a public miracle witnessed by 70,000 people. John Paul II practically dedicated his entire pontificate to Our Lady of Fatima, although one will certainly differ over whether he was faithful to the imperatives of the message for reasons that were perhaps placed beyond his control, as I'll mention in a moment. So they can't attack the message directly. They have to attack it in the only way they think they can do it successfully, which is to appear to be friendly to the message of Fatima. Unlike Mark Antony, who came to praise Caesar, not to bury him, these false friends of Fatima come to bury the message of Fatima while they pretend to praise it. And so we see developing in the church a party line on Fatima. This is the party line of the party of the innovators. And what do I mean by a party line? A party line is an official version of reality that is contrary to reality. It's precisely why a party line is needed. to persuade people to ignore the real world and live in the strange, bizarre world dictated by the party line in order to obscure the way things really are. It's a joke about a Russian commissar doing the collectivization of Soviet agriculture, who appears at the local potato commune to demand an accounting from the person who's running the commune about the great potato harvest that, of course, is going to happen under the collectivization policy. "Comrade," he asks, "what do you have to tell me about the potato harvest?" And the head of the commune says, "Why, comrade, the harvest of potatoes is as high as the eye of God." And the commissar says, "Well, comrade, you know there is no God." "Yes," he answers, "and there are no potatoes." The party line on Fatima is designed to persuade us that there are potatoes when there are no potatoes. And according to the party line on Fatima, Russia has been consecrated without having been consecrated. There's been no mention of Russia in any of these ceremonies, and there is to be no consecration of Russia by name according to the party line, because this would offend the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Church, since Vatican II, is no longer in the conversion of nations business. That is the divine commission of the Church, but that's no longer the business of the Church in the post-conciliar period. Likewise, there is to be no triumph of the Immaculate Heart, which would involve, first of all, the conversion of Russia, followed by the reconversion of the Western world and perhaps the entire globe. No. That kind of triumphalism is a thing of the past. We must have none of that. This is the age of interreligious dialogue, ecumenism, and Ostpolitik. There is, of course, to be no revelation of the third secret in its entirety. The text that clearly exists, the only text that would make sense of the obscurities of the vision, published in 2000, that is not to be revealed. Evidently, and I agree with Sochi on this, certain people in the Vatican apparatus have determined that this is not authentic, this text. It merely consists of some annotations by Sister Lucia. The vision only, we are told, is the third secret of Fatima, and that vision, we are told, even more absurdly, is a vision of John Paul II escaping death at the hands of an assassin, when the vision shows a pope being killed by a band of soldiers. Utterly nonsensical. Now, there's a paradoxical element of this. Yes, there are plenty of potatoes version of the Fatima message, the party line on Fatima. And the paradoxical element is that the purveyors of the party line want to tell us over and over again just how wonderful the Fatima message is. Isn't it a wonderful thing that Our Lady has prescribed for us? This life of prayer and penance that she enjoins upon us. Yes, we must repeat that 1,000 times. Fatima enjoins us to prayer and penance, prayer and penance, prayer and penance, and isn't that just wonderful? Now, of course, prayer and penance are essential. They're essential to the Fatima message. But there are prophetic elements in the Fatima message which show us that the principal aim of the prayer and penance is to achieve what Our Lady of Fatima requested, the consecration and conversion of Russia and the triumph of her Immaculate Heart, which had been neatly excised from the Fatima message by the party line. Now, the party line is dictated from the top. We can call this Operation False Friends of Fatima. And the operation dictated from the top has at its head, from the beginning, the Vatican Secretary of State. And the one who took the laboring oar on this project was Cardinal Sodano. He started the ball rolling with his so-called interpretation of the third secret of Fatima, which I've just indicated for you, which has nothing to do with the vision and is utterly nonsensical. Now, Cardinal Sodano, and I'm going to be blunt here, I'm sorry, but I don't think we have time for diplomacy at this point. Cardinal Sodano is a fixer, an ecclesiastical fixer. And we know from reliable reports, many sources, that in the 1980s and 1990s, he was intimately involved in covering up the Father Maciel scandal. His friend, Father Maciel, was funneling large amounts of money into Vatican coffers and buying protection. And Cardinal Sodano's role in that cover-up was clear, and we know that it took Cardinal Ratzinger to overrule Sodano's policy of covering this up and order a thorough canonical investigation, which culminated in Maciel being sent off to a monastery to spend his life in prayer and penance, after which he died. This is the man, we're told, is the oracle of Fatima, who's going to interpret for us the meaning of the third secret of Fatima. It is utterly ridiculous. But more than ridiculous, it places the church and the world at peril. And yet this is the situation in which we find ourselves. And Cardinal Sodano has dictated this party line from the top down, and anyone who wants the approval of the Vatican apparatus for his Fatima apostolate needs to hew to the party line. And that's the purpose of our book, to discuss some of these people who, in return for official approval for their adherence to the party line, are basically selling out the mission that Our Lady launched at Cova de Iria back in 1917. I'm not going to go through the whole book and give you all the details. That's what the book is for. But I want to note a few highlights about some of these false friends of Fatima. First of all, we have the Blue Army. Now, the Blue Army began as a noble organization with a noble aim. It was, in fact, a Blue Army, a militant advocate of the mission launched by Our Lady of Fatima, the consecration of Russia, and the conversion of Russia, the West, and the world, indeed, and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. But something happened around 1984 because of the new orientation of the church. The order came down from on high that this was no longer to be pursued as a Fatima objective, this militant approach to seeking the conversion of Russia, the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, and so forth. There was a fundamental shift in the Blue Army around 1984 when Bishop Hastrich declared, this is actually a little earlier, in 1982 in Soul magazine, and I'm quoting, "Instead of praying for the conversion of Russia, we are rather to pray that members of the Blue Army would so pray and fast that they themselves might be thoroughly converted. To pray for the conversion of Russia may seem like waving a red flag in front of a bull." With those words, the Blue Army began to disband itself. Now consider what he's saying here, that what Our Lady prescribed, the Virgin most prudent, the seat of wisdom, was waving a red flag in front of a bull. Now, I mentioned Ostpolitik a moment ago. Here we have a smoking gun in the pronouncements of the Blue Army itself, that what they were doing, reorienting the Fatima message to prayer and penance and the conversion of the individual, was dictated by the Vatican's policy of Ostpolitik. Because in the same article, we read, "We might pray explicitly for Russia if we wish to do so, but in our public message, we should avoid upsetting the delicate balance of international affairs which the Holy See is trying so hard to control and direct," end quote. So here is the spokesman for the Blue Army admitting that Vatican diplomacy has overruled the Mother of God and the message of Fatima. They are trying to correct the delicate balance of international affairs, and now Our Lady of Fatima must get out of the way so that these men can do their work, their important work of Ostpolitik, and fixing the delicate balance of international affairs. Now, Hannes Fraser said something about this change of orientation, in an important article he wrote, and I believe it was in 1986, where he says, and I quote, "Hitherto the campaign for devotion to the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary was given special urgency by the Sacred Heart's own message to Sister Lucia that no initiative could possibly expect to be fruitful unless envisioned as a means of glorifying the heart of his mother, and that only by Russia's consecration to that heart, and by no other means, is it possible to obtain Russia's conversion and world peace," which is what Father Gruner has been saying for 25 years. And then Hannes Fraser concluded that this shift of orientation from prayer and penance to effect the consecration and conversion of Russia to prayer and penance to effect our individual conversion is, as he says, and I'm quoting, "A more effective recipe for failure could scarcely be devised." And that's what the party line prescribes and what we've been suffering through, a recipe for failure, avoiding the consecration of Russia, stripping the Fatima message of its militantly prophetic elements, and neutralizing it so that it comports with the party line. And in the book, I discussed 3 other friends of Fatima, those who were present and presided over the 2000 press conference at which the vision of the bishop in white was published, and we were told that was the entirety of the third secret of Fatima. And there, Cardinal Sodano came to the fore. We see Father Cardinal Ratzinger advising us again and again, and I'm quoting from the official booklet the Vatican released on June 26, 2000, quote, "Before attempting an interpretation of the third secret, the main lines of which could be found in the statement read by Cardinal Sodano," next quote, "for this reason, the figurative language of the vision is symbolic. In this regard, Cardinal Sodano stated," and the next quote, "as is clear from the documentation presented here, the interpretation offered by Cardinal Sodano in his statement on 13 May, and the next question, quote, "First of all, we must affirm with Cardinal Sodano," etc., etc. No fewer than 4 times, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at that time said we must follow Cardinal Sodano's interpretation of the third secret of Fatima. Absolutely incredible. The fixer, who at that very moment was busy covering up the Father Maciel scandal, is going to dictate to the Catholic Church and to the world the meaning of the third secret of Fatima. And one more quote, and this is the gist of the party line, from Cardinal Ratzinger, quoting Cardinal Sodano in the same booklet. "We must affirm with Cardinal Sodano that the events to which the third part of the secret of Fatima refers now seem part of the past. Insofar as individual events are described, they belong to the past." Thus spake the Cardinal Secretary of State. And in the book, I talk about people who, in organizations below the level of the Secretary of State, are following the party line and receiving official favor in return for that. One of these personages is Father Fox. I've written about him extensively. I won't go over all of that now, but I will mention a couple of things about an article he wrote against Father Gruner in 2004, which I cite in the book. And in that article, Father Fox sneers at the very idea that Russia will convert. Father Fox says, in this article attacking Father Gruner, that it is ridiculous to, and I quote, "hold to a position that a paradise on earth, a Russia suddenly turning itself into a people of converted holiness, and even as Roman Catholics, must immediately follow a collegial consecration," end quote. He simply denies that there would be a miraculous conversion of Russia. And what did Our Lady proclaim when she came to Fatima? A regime change? The rise of a market economy in Russia? He flatly denies the miraculous nature of the event that Our Lady predicted. And Father Fox goes on to cover up what was happening at that time at the Fatima Shrine. We all know about the situation in which Monsignor Guerra, the now retired rector, had opened up the Fatima Shrine to other religions and had allowed the Hindus to go into the very sanctuary of the Fatima Shrine to conduct a Hindu ritual, praying to their Hindu gods. And we read in the press the account of Father Guerra's statement, and this is what he said about his plans for the Fatima Shrine. "The future of Fatima, or the adoration of God and his mother at this holy shrine, must pass through the creation of a shrine where different religions can mingle. The interreligious dialogue in Portugal and in the Catholic Church is still in an embryonic phase, but the Shrine of Fatima is not indifferent to this fact and is already open to being a universalistic place of vocation." This is a complete outrage and insult to the Mother of God and Him who sent her. it's nothing less than a sacrilege. And Father Fox attempted to cover it up. He accused Father Gruner of scare stories, and he published in this article a section entitled "Fatima to Retain Its Catholic Identity." Well, thank you, Father Fox. It's good to know that Fatima will retain its Catholic identity, but isn't that rather like saying in an article with a headline, St. Peter's Basilica will retain its Catholic identity? That is not a reassurance, but only a confirmation of what is going on there. One of the principal friends of Fatima I discuss in the book, False Friends of Fatima, is Father Andrew Apostoli, a celebrity of the Eternal Word television network, that appalling blend of the modern, the traditional, and the in-between, this stew of things that now passes for the gold standard of Catholicism. He's a celebrity on that network. He wrote a book entitled Fatima for Today. And in this book, he doggedly promotes the party line on Fatima. And this book came out a few months after Pope Benedict demolished the party line on Fatima during his pilgrimage to Fatima, when he said the things I said about the third secret, that it speaks of future realities of the church, and when he also said he deceives himself who thinks that the prophetic mission of Fatima is concluded. It's a self-deception and a deception of others. That's what the Pope said. But according to Fatima for Today by Father Apostoli, it's as if the Pope had never spoken. Father Apostoli is still doggedly pursuing the Vatican Secretary of State's party line. Russia is consecrated, the third secret is revealed, Fatima is consigned to the past, and what is left of Fatima is your prayer, your penance, and your personal conversion. Fatima is looking in the mirror, make yourself a better Christian, while the world goes to blazes. Now, in this book, we don't find Cardinal Sodano any longer, because Cardinal Sodano's version has been discredited, as Sochi said, because of what the Pope said during his pilgrimage to Fatima in 2010. So for this book, they trotted out a new Vatican prelate to lend it the appearance of legitimacy. Of course, this is a book marketed on Amazon.com by a private publishing company, Ignatius Press. Its authority in terms of magisterial teaching is zip. It's just a book you can buy on Amazon.com. But they stuck a preface by Cardinal Burke of the Apostolic Signatura in there. And according to Cardinal Burke, we really shouldn't concern ourselves too much about the message of Fatima any longer, beyond, of course, everybody together, prayer and penance, because there's really nothing much new in the message of Fatima, as he put it on page 195 of this book. He cites a Jesuit by the name of C.C. Martindale, and he says, and I'm quoting Cardinal Burke, "Inasmuch as hell is not a novel doctrine, and thus the vision of hell contains no novel or startling information." Nothing new or startling in the message of Fatima, says Cardinal Burke, lending appearance of authority to this ridiculous book. But there is just a bit of new information, I think. There are a few points that I think Cardinal Burke overlooked, with all due respect. The imminent end of World War I, prophesied by Our Lady of Fatima. Commencement of World War II, after the appearance of a strange light in the night sky. During the pontificate of Pius XI, identified by name in the prophecy. The spread of Russia's errors throughout the world. That's somewhat new in 1917. The loss of souls, further wars and persecutions of the church, the martyrdom of the faithful, the suffering of the Pope, the annihilation of nations, and lastly, the connection of all these future events to an ultimatum. That they will all take place unless Our Lady of Fatima's specific requests are granted, including the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart and the communions of reparation on the 5 first Saturdays. I think Cardinal Burke missed a few items of information that are indeed new in the message of Fatima. But according to Cardinal Burke, and I quote, Pope Benedict concludes that the secret is, in the end, wait for it, the exhortation to prayer, and likewise the summons to penance and conversion. Here we have this endlessly thematic drumming in of one point. It's prayer and penance, prayer and penance. But there's a bit of a deception going on here. It wasn't Pope Benedict that said that. It was Cardinal Ratzinger who said that in the official commentary on the message of Fatima back in 2000, not Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict, as I've just shown you, said in 2010, the message of Fatima involves a prophetic mission that is not concluded. It involves future realities which are revealing themselves today, little by little, in a very terrifying way, and speaks of a persecution of the church worse than any external persecution, but rather one involving internal enemies of the church who attack her from within. And yet Cardinal Burke wants us to believe that all Pope Benedict thinks, referring to Cardinal Ratzinger 12 years ago and not telling us that, is that the message of Fatima is just a call to prayer and penance. Now, in this book, Father Apostoli discredits himself and his book and his entire thesis by one misstep. The same misstep by which Cardinal Sodano destroyed his own credibility. Because in this book, Father Apostoli says the following: because Sister Lucia had chosen the year 1960 as the time to reveal the third secret, curiosity and even dread about what the message might contain had heightened significantly over the years. I want to dwell on this point because it's so crucial. He is signing on to the proposition that Sister Lucy chose the year 1960. That's what Cardinal Cardinal Bertone claimed. He insisted that Sister Lucia never had any communication from the Blessed Virgin Mary linking the third secret of Fatima to the year 1960. He insisted upon that point for 7 years and told us that Sister Lucy had confessed this to him. And then he went on camera in 2007 on the Italian television show Porta a Porta, Door to Door, the most popular television talk show in Italy, and he held up before the camera 2 envelopes, each pertaining to the third secret. And on the outside of each envelope, Sister Lucia had written, by express order of the Blessed Virgin, this envelope may only be opened in 1960 by the Bishop of Fatima or the Portugal or the Patriarch of Lisbon, by express order of the Virgin. For 7 years, he never mentioned that she had written down this express order on the outside of those 2 envelopes. For 7 years, he had us believing, or would have had us believe, that Lucia simply made up the year 1960 when the evidence in his own hands, presented to the cameras, seen by millions, showed him to be, quite simply, a liar. Sister Lucia never made this up. It was an express order of the Virgin, confirmed for history in perpetuity by what she wrote on those 2 envelopes. And because he made that representation, which is demonstrably false, a blatant lie, the attribution of a lie to the seer who would not lie, nothing, Sodano says, is worthy of belief. Because if you catch a witness in one flat-out, demonstrable lie, why should you believe anything else he has to say? And yet, Father Andrew Apostoli in this book adopts the same lie. His entire book should be consigned to the spazzatura, as the Italians say, the garbage can. But let us proceed a little bit further with this book, because he adopts the party line by draping himself in the interpretation of the Fatima message by Cardinal Sodano. Who cares what Cardinal Sodano thinks about what the message of Fatima means? Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said in the 2000 press conference, the Church does not impose an interpretation. And the interpretation that the Pope has given us in 2010, which is actually what it really reveals, is exactly to the contrary, as I've just told you repeatedly. But according to Father Apostoli, I'm quoting, Cardinal Sodano said that the children saw a prophetic vision which must be understood as symbolic. Must? According to who? The fixer? He who hid the Maciel scandal? He is the Fatima oracle for the rest of us? It's absurd. He continues to quote the Secretary of State as if he were a Fatima oracle. He cites Cardinal Sodano's opinion that the vision does not describe photographically the details of future events and must be interpreted in a symbolic key. No, it mustn't. It must be interpreted in accordance with Our Lady's interpretation, which is to be found in the text that, as Antonio Socci says, is ben nascosto, well hidden in the Vatican. But according to Father Apostoli, quoting again Cardinal Ratzinger, this symbolic vision depicts, and I quote, man himself, with his inventions, has forged the flaming sword. In the vision, we see an angel with a flaming sword. The flames are emanating toward the earth, threatening to destroy it. Our Lady repels the flames, but not after vast destruction has already occurred. And according to Father Apostoli, citing the Fatima oracle, Father Sodano the Fixer, that's only the threat of nuclear war. So according to Father Andrew Apostoli of the EWTN network, there really is no angel with a flaming sword. There really is no future execution of a pope. There is no half-ruined city filled with corpses from which a hobbling pope escapes before being executed. No, there's just the threat of nuclear war. Man himself forges the flaming sword. And we are literally expected to trust the fate of the entire world to this interpretation by Cardinal Sodano, according to Father Apostoli, in a book with a preface by Cardinal Burke, who knows nothing about the subject and has no competence in the matter. Now, we're also told that the vision of the bishop in white, according to Cardinal Sodano, and thus according to Father Apostoli, who follows the party line, is John Paul II, as I said, not being killed. The Pope being killed in the vision is a Pope not being killed. This is their story, and they're sticking to it. Now, here's the problem with that. According to Father Apostoli, he argues, well, the Pope lost 6 pints of blood. It was as if he had died and then been snatched back from the jaws of death. Well, close enough for government work, meaning the government of the Vatican City State under Cardinal Sodano. And that's the party line. He's following it to the letter, even though it's been discredited by the Pope himself during his pilgrimage to Fatima. Now, there's something very curious in Father Apostoli's book, and I want to dwell on this for a moment. What the Pope said at Fatima is this: as for the new things, he's speaking of the third secret, as for the new things which we can find in this message today, there is also the fact that attacks on the Pope and the Church come not only from without, but the sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church, from the sin existing within the Church. Focus on the first phrase. As for the new things which we can find in this message today, there is also the fact that. Here's the translation in Father Apostoli's book of the same passage. It begins, attacks on the Pope and the Church do not come only from the outside, but the sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church, etc. He omitted the beginning of the paragraph. As for the new things which we can find in this message today, he omitted the phrase which links the attacks on the Church from within to the new things which we find in the third secret as revealed by the Pope. I find that interesting. Now, Father Apostoli also claims that the text of the secret contains no words attributed to the Blessed Virgin Mary, because according to him, citing, of course, Cardinal Sodano, it's merely a vision. Our Lady chose not to speak to the seers. But he, like Cardinal Sodano, ignores the fourth memoir, which the Vatican apparatus, Cardinal Sodano and Cardinal Bertone, have been avoiding like the plague since 2000. Because in the fourth memoir, we know that Our Lady said to the seers, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc., etc. being added by Sister Lucia to indicate some crisis outside of Portugal involving dogma, And for this reason, the Vatican avoided the fourth memoir and used the third memoir in 2000, when, in the official booklet, the Vatican itself admits that Sister Lucia wrote the fourth memoir to give a more complete rendering of the Fatima message. Why would the Vatican avoid the more complete rendering in favor of the less complete rendering in the third memoir? Because it doesn't want us to know about what's in the more complete rendering, which is found within that famous etc. There's no other explanation for that. There can't be any other reasonable explanation. But Father Apostoli says nothing about the etc., just the way Cardinal Bertone says nothing about the etc., just the way Cardinal Sodano says nothing about the etc., just the way nobody in charge of this affair, the Vatican, has ever bothered to ask Sister Lucia what is in the etc., because either they know and don't want us to know, or they don't want to know, because they have a very good idea of what's in that etc., which is what we're living through right now. The crisis in the Church, which as Pope Benedict revealed, is disclosing itself little by little, more and more, in a terrifying way today, not 50 years ago. Now, he also addresses this idea that we have a problem, which we do, in the fact that the vision is not in the form of a letter. And Sister Lucia said again and again and again to various witnesses that she had confided the third secret of Fatima to the Bishop of Fatima in a sealed envelope in the form of a letter, which would be addressed to somebody. It would have a salutation and a closing, like any other letter. Now, Father Apostoli doesn't deny this testimony of various people that Sister Lucia spoke of a letter. Here's how he handles that one. This was not an emphatic point they were making, he says about all these witnesses. So in other words, when witnesses say, Sister Lucia revealed that the third secret is in the form of a letter, the testimony is worthless unless they add, and this is an emphatic point that I am making. Well, how about Pope John the 23rd, who said that the commissary of the Holy Office brought to him a text of the secret, concerning which he said, he brought me the letter containing the third part of the secrets of Fatima. I intend to read it with my confessor. But apparently, we're not to believe the testimony of Pope John the 23rd, because after all, he didn't say, and I emphasize this point. I emphasize that it's a letter. That's how Father Apostoli handles that smoking gun, which is one of about 100 pieces of evidence. I can't possibly go over them all here. Let me discuss another point. In an appendix to Fatima for today, trying to explain, in keeping with the party line, why Russia hasn't been consecrated, why everything in the world has been mentioned but Russia. In fact, I have a standing joke about this. Why don't they just have a consecration ceremony or an entrustment ceremony, whatever they want to call it, in which they say something like, we consecrate every blessed thing on the face of the earth except Russia. Which is what they've done, effectively. They've even consecrated Youth in Search of Meaning in the 2000 attempt at a consecration. Anyway, here's his explanation. He quotes Bishop Paul Joseph Cordus, and he reveals it all to us. I recall that Pope John Paul II thought, sometime before the consecration, of mentioning Russia in the prayer of benediction. That would be nice. Our Lady called for the consecration of Russia. He thought maybe we should mention Russia. But at the suggestion of his collaborators, he abandoned the idea. He could not risk such a direct provocation of the Soviet leader. The Pope also decided not to mention Russia directly out of sensitivity to the Orthodox bishops he had invited to join in the consecration prayer. So, this is Bishop Cordus speaking, for good reasons he followed the discreet approach of Pius XII and of the bishops of the Second Vatican Council, where he himself was very prominent. Well, he's referring to apparently to the consecration of the world, which was not done by the bishops, but by Paul VI, in which there was no mention of Russia. So the discreet approach is not to mention Russia. And Pius XII, in fact, did mention Russia in an apostolic letter after having done a consecration which mentioned only the world. So he wasn't afraid of provoking a nuclear war by offending the Soviet leader when he mentioned Russia in an apostolic letter. Unfortunately, that did not suffice. And no one, not even the Fatima false friends, are claiming that what Pius XII did produced the consecration and conversion of Russia. So we have it from Bishop Cordes that John Paul II was talked out of doing what Our Lady requested by his collaborators, that he abandoned the idea of doing precisely what Our Lady requested. He abandoned it. He didn't do it, as Bishop Cordes admitted. He abandoned it. And that's in Father Apostoli's own book. And so we haven't had a conversion of Russia. And how does Father Apostoli handle that problem? Clearly there's no conversion of Russia. 5% of the Russian Orthodox practice Russian Orthodoxy. Many of them are nominal Russian Orthodox, but there is no practice of religion in that country on any great scale. There are just as many Catholics in Russia today as there were at the time of the Russian Revolution, and most of them are in Siberia. Russian priests, almost none of them are Russian-born. Almost all of them require 90-day entry visas, and they have to keep leaving the country every 3 months. The Church can't sink any roots in Russia to bring about Russia's conversion in the only way that makes sense, a conversion to the Catholic faith. But according to Father Apostoli, and this is how he addresses the problem, there's a conversion process going on. Yes, it's a process of conversion involving, as he puts it, gradual changes. So Our Lady of Fatima said, in the end, there will be a gradual process of gradual changes in Russia. And someday, who knows when, qui sait, my Immaculate Heart will triumph, perhaps 100 years later, but there will someday be a triumph after this conversion process, in the midst of which Russia will remain the abortion capital of the world, the child pornography capital of the world, a place where there are more abortions than live births, where people are dying of alcoholism at a record rate, where the life expectancy has dropped and the population is dwindling at the rate of 700,000 a year, producing such desperation in the Soviet leadership that they're trying to put some limits on abortion on demand in Russia. Too little, too late. But confronted with this nonsensical claim, Father Apostoli retreats to the last ditch, as the Italians would say, l'ultima spiaggia, the last beachhead. And he says this, now if the Pope believed in his heart that he had made the consecration properly, what are these people who still deny the consecration thinking? That's the argument from authority. The Pope supposedly believes he made the consecration. And therefore, who are we to say otherwise? Because the Pope believes it. Of course, the Pope doesn't believe it. He abandoned the idea. And Father Gruner has shown again and again that in 1984, during the consecration ceremony and hours afterwards, the Pope said that Our Lady is still awaiting the consecration of Russia. And in multiple venues, he said, we did all that we could within our poor human limitations. In other words, he felt his hands were tied by his collaborators, who, as Bishop Cordes said, prevailed upon him to abandon the whole idea of Russia's consecration. So much for Father Apostoli's attempt to explain why Russia hasn't converted. Which brings me to the last of our false friends. The latest iteration of the former Blue Army, which laid down its guns back in the 80s and surrendered, and now calls itself the World Apostolate of Fatima. Now, the World Apostolate of Fatima has obtained official Vatican approval. In 2006, it obtained pro forma approval from the Pontifical Council for the Laity, which erected it as a society of pontifical right, which is nothing more than a statement of the Vatican saying, we've reviewed the statutes of this organization. It is allowed to exist as an association of the faithful with our approval. But that approval is not required for any association of the faithful. Under canon law, if you want to pursue that kind of approval, you can do so and obtain it. But as the Code of Canon Law makes clear, we have the right to proceed without such approval. Nevertheless, they've obtained this approval. And now they're claiming that they are the only legitimate Fatima apostolate in the world. And that we, the World Apostolate of Fatima, are the voice of Fatima. And now they feel themselves perfectly positioned to promote the party line, which is the quid pro quo. We give you approval. You are now the legitimate Fatima apostolate, and at least tacitly the agreement is you will now promote the party line. And you will do so unswervingly. You will tell us about the great potato harvest. And so the World Apostolate of Fatima, and I'm giving you an example in the book, it was an hour-long show on EWTN, August 22nd, 2010, in which Father Apostoli, who's the spiritual advisor of the World Apostolate of Fatima, and Michael LaCourte, the executive director of the United States branch of the World Apostolate of Fatima, spoke to each other about how wonderful and terrific and full of hope the message of Fatima is, according to the party line. And you know what that means. Lots and lots and lots of prayer and penance. Fatima means prayer and penance. Don't believe the message of Fatima is fulfilled, said Mr. LaCourte. No, no, no. There's much more to be done. Is it the consecration of Russia that needs to be done? The revelation of the third secret? No, 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 no. It's prayer and penance. That doesn't mean the Holy Father, he has done the consecration. That part has been fulfilled, said Father Apostoli. And LaCourte said, yes, yes. But then Father Apostoli said, we have to follow through with prayer, sacrifice, offering of even our sufferings, a good Christian life. Father Apostoli went on to say, the message of Fatima, you couldn't say it any more neatly than this. The message of Fatima can be put in two words, prayer and sacrifice. That's it. We're down to two words now. Forget the glorious fulfillment of the promises Our Lady came to deliver, the promises she made on behalf of the Son of God. No, no, it's two words, prayer and penance. Your prayer and your penance for your personal conversion in front of your mirror in your personal abode, wherever it is you like to pray. And then said Apostoli to LaCourte, commenting on what LaCourte just said, the importance of Mary's message is seen, as you summed it up so well there, with the words, prayer and sacrifice. Our Lady of Fatima, said Apostoli, kept asking for prayers and for sacrifice. We have to do our part. The Pope has done his part. Oh, it's done. Done, and over and done with. No need to worry about that any longer. So if we keep focusing on the Pope and worrying about what he is doing and not doing, we're mistaken. We need to be able to look at our part. Are we living those good Christian lives? Or are we, offending God? Forget the Pope. Don't worry about any of that stuff. You have to be a good Christian. Well, of course we have to be a good Christian, but this is how the modernist works. The modernist works by using one truth to hide another truth. Talk about prayer and penance until you're blue in the face. So everybody forgets about what the prayer and penance is aimed at. And the ultimate result of prayer and penance is promised by Our Lady of Fatima, the conversion of Russia. But it gets worse, much worse, because the party line is broadened into a new area of operations. It isn't enough to convert the message of Fatima into our personal prayer, penance, and conversion. No, no, no. The message has to be substantively converted into something much more suitable to the party line. Hail the new interreligious message of Fatima. Yes, the World Apostolate of Fatima is not only promoting Fatima Light, as I call it, which is prayer and penance on an individual basis, but now a radical reductionism that not only strips the Fatima message of its prophetic and Catholic content, but turns it into the appearance at the Cova de Iria of Our Lady of Interreligious Dialogue. That's what Fatima is all about now, according to the World Apostolate of Fatima. And during this hour-long TV show, Mr. LaCourte spoke of his trip to the Russian city of Kazan, where he spoke with a Russian named Dmitri. Dimitri is working for, and I quote, "one world praying for life and peace." I said to Dimitri, we would love it if we could film the Muslims praying, along with the Orthodox and the Catholics and everybody else in Kazan, all the religions, praying with us for life and peace, and then air it on EWTN, which is now the network of Fatima Life. Yes, all the religions, and the more religions, the better. Now he recounts a celebration of a return of the icon of Kazan to the city of Kazan, and he says, and I quote, "half the people that attended that celebration were Orthodox, and the other half were Muslim." And he spent part of his time in Kazan going to these beautiful mosques, he said. So folks who support the World Apostolate of Fatima and send your donations in to this legitimate Fatima organization, you've sent a man over there to tour the mosques and to set up an appointment with Dimitri to film the Muslims and the Orthodox and the Catholics and anybody else who cares to join in having their interreligious prayers for peace, which won't, of course, have anything to do with the conversion of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And so what we see here is the promotion of the Vatican line on interreligious dialogue. And according to Mr. LaCourte, who is promoting something that he calls the worldwide interreligious prayer campaign, Our Lady requested Catholics to pray the Rosary, but everyone else can pray according to their faith and build up at least 15 minutes of meditative prayer. So he wants to get prayer groups going among all the religions. The Buddhists can pray, they can meditate on nirvana. The Muslims can pray to Allah. The Buddhists can pray to their semi-divinized Buddha. You can pray to the many-armed God, Vishnu. Whatever floats your religious boat, pray to that God for 15 minutes, because you'll be helping achieve the new message of Fatima's fulfillment. And as he went on to say, anybody can do this, no matter what your faith is, because we all align with these intentions. All the religions align with the Fatima intentions. Peace, brotherhood, brotherly love, that's what Fatima is all about. And the purpose is because we know, he says, that when we don't open the door to God in prayer, our lives become more self-centered and material-oriented, leaving little room, if any, for God. So Fatima is now an interreligious, worldwide, spiritual self-improvement program. This is what the only legitimate, quote-unquote, Fatima apostolate is now promoting in place of the real thing. The specifically Catholic message of Fatima has been converted into what LaCourte calls universal Fatima intentions, which are for the non-Catholics. And then there's the Catholic intentions, which we can pray as we see fit. But there's a problem, because the universal Fatima intentions are the ones Our Lady identified, and these are the Catholic intentions, because the Catholic Church is the universal church. The universal Fatima intentions are the consecration of Russia, the conversion of Russia, and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, not interreligious harmony and brotherhood. And yet this is what the World Apostolate of Fatima is promoting with Vatican approval, trumpeting itself as the only legitimate voice among the laity on the message of Fatima. So you see what official approval does. It legitimates the party line, perpetuates the promulgation of error in the Church, and makes it possible for the adversary to go on suppressing the truth about Fatima, delaying the consecration of Russia, the conversion of Russia, and the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, as long as possible, perhaps until the world is destroyed. That's what he would like to see. That's what the adversary is up to. And here, the World Apostolate of Fatima is following dutifully the party line on Fatima, announcing to the world what a great harvest of potatoes we will have if only we follow the Stalinist dictates of the new order of Fatima. And what they're promoting is exactly the error condemned by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Mortalium Animos, written in 1927. Namely, and I quote, "The false opinion which considers all religions to be more or less good and praiseworthy, since they all in different ways manifest and signify that sense which is inborn in us all, by which we are led to God and to the obedient acknowledgement of all of his rule. Not only are those who hold this opinion in error and deceived," remember what the Pope said, he deceives himself, who thinks the prophetic mission of Fatima is concluded. Not only are those who hold this opinion in error and deceived, but little by little, he says, they turn aside to naturalism and atheism, as it is called, from which it clearly follows that one who supports those who hold these theories and attempt to realize them is altogether abandoning the divinely revealed religion. And ultimately, that's what this is all about. The party line on Fatima is ultimately about abandoning divine revelation. Echoed, as Father Gruner says, in the message of Fatima, the woman clothed in the sun, as we see in the book of the Apocalypse, who comes to save us from the tail of the dragon, who drags a third of the consecrated souls from their lofty stations down into degradation, to the destruction of faith and discipline in the church, and to the peril of the world. But that's all revelation. We don't care about that. We care about personal self-improvement on a religious level with all the religions of the world. Now to conclude, let me tell you what I think we have to do about this. In the book, I call for a Magna Carta of liberation from the party line on Fatima. And it has these elements. First, the false friends of Fatima do not own the message of Fatima. It has not been given to them, but to the church and to the world. It belongs to us, to everyone, to all of humanity. There is no official Fatima apostolate that has a patent or a copyright or a trademark on the message of Fatima. It's ours. It's all of humanity's. Second, these people have no authority whatsoever. None over the message of Fatima. They have no right to interpret it. They have no right to custody of it. They have no right to tell us what to do in response to it. If the Pope should choose to make some infallible pronouncement on it in a binding way, that would be a different matter. These people have no authority whatsoever to dictate to a single solitary soul anywhere in the church anything whatsoever about the message of Fatima. Let's be over and done with these self-appointed proprietors of the Fatima message. No one has done more good for the Fatima message than someone who doesn't claim proprietorship, and I mean Father Nicholas Gruner, who has no official approval, and given the state of the church today, thank God he doesn't. Third, the message, the opinions these people express concerning the message of Fatima are nothing more than their opinions. And as we can see from even a cursory examination of them, their opinions are utterly, completely worthless. Fourth, they have no right to prevent the faithful from exercising their right under God to petition the Holy Father to do what must be done for the sake of the cause of Fatima, which is the consecration of Russia and the total revelation of the third secret of Fatima. And they have the right to do so incessantly, again and again and again, until it's done, like the woman in the gospel who pestered the unresponsive judge until the judge finally did his duty and rendered justice in her case. And that's why our Lord gave us this parable. Don't let human respect dissuade you from being a pest, a righteous pest, a pest with a holy motivation, in demanding respectfully and with due regard for the office that you're petitioning, the consecration of Russia and the revelation of the third secret. Father Gruner did that in Rome with some advertisements respecting the consecration of Italy, and he obtained it within days. Pope conducted a consecration of the nation of Italy to the Immaculate Heart of Mary after the billboards went up and the signs went up. Yes, give him a round of applause. And finally, our Magna Carta has to come down to something pretty fierce, but it has to be done. This idea of reducing the message of Fatima to a prescription for interreligious brotherhood rather than heaven's call for the kingship of Christ and the triumph of Mary and the reign of Mary is, I spare no solicitude for these people because they don't deserve any, is a mockery and a blasphemy. And we must oppose it as such. We must call these people what they are. They are blasphemers. How dare they show a video, which is what you'll find on the World Apostolate of Fatima website, calling people to pray for Fatima while you see images of Muslims at Mecca and Hindus engaged in prayer to their substitute deities. How dare they attempt to transport the faithful from the vehicle Our Lady gave us into their man-made vehicle, which is leading us over the cliff. How dare they? They must be opposed in the strongest terms possible and called what they are. Blasphemers, mockers of God. They are mocking him. And I'm not saying that they're subjectively guilty of it. It may be entirely foolishness on their part, which is a point that has occurred to me. With the World Apostolate of Fatima, it looks like the Vatican has entrusted the message of Fatima to bumbling incompetence, and that the Vatican wants it exactly that way. Let's turn it over to these clownish people who will say anything, no matter how ridiculous, will speak of a consecration of Russia that wasn't consecrated, a conversion of Russia that isn't converted, and peace in the world that isn't peace. Let's let them play with the message of Fatima and delude everybody. And the more incompetent, the better. So that's our Magna Carta. And people will say, well, that's an ambitious program. No, it isn't. It's a program that this apostolate has succeeded greatly in moving us toward the fulfillment of. And it's a program that we have it in our power as members of the laity to accomplish. Through our prayers, through our incessant petitions, storming the walls of the Vatican through every respectful means available to us in this age of social communications until what must be done is done. And only then will we see what Our Lady has promised us from the beginning. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. Thank you.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you. And I wrote back to him and I said, I appreciate very much your interest and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture. That we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us. These things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before. Just looking at the Catholic Church, for example, the only other time in church history that comes close to this time is the Arian crisis, when 90% of the bishops were Arian. And there was only about 3 or 4 bishops who actually stood up, and the greatest of them all, St. Athanasius, was actually excommunicated by the Pope in 357 AD. Now, he wasn't really excommunicated because, as the Church has always recognized, as St. Thomas points out, that law is not something that just the legislator says. Law is the ordination of reason. It is for the common good. And as the Church law to this day points out, that no one can be punished if he doesn't commit a crime. So because Athanasius was standing up for the faith, because he was defending the faith, which was his duty to do, he could not be punished even if the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication. In fact, Liberius regretted his action, but Liberius is the first Pope not to be canonized from the time of St. Peter to the year 357. It's well for us to remember then that we need not be afraid of the judgments of men if we are on the right side of God. It's a principle that we need to keep in mind. We also have to understand that prophecy is a function in the Church. It's a function that will never go away. It's a function that must be respected, just as the apostolic offices must be respected. As St. Paul tells us in Ephesians, the Church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, not just the apostles. The role of prophecy is essential. Scripture tells us that we must not extinguish the Spirit. We must not despise prophecy, but we must test all things and hold fast that which is good. So that is why I've promoted the message of Fatima, not only because it's unique among all the messages, but of course it's been approved by the Church. As Father Joseph St. Marie pointed out here in Rome, he was the one who wrote the speech for the Pope in 1982 when he went to Fatima. Father Joseph St. Marie points out that it is the role of the hierarchy to judge, to test whether the prophet speaks the truth. But once the hierarchy recognizes that the message comes from God, then the Pope himself and the bishops are bound to obey, not the prophet, but God who speaks through the prophet to them. That obligation is primordial. That is not for us to say, I'm telling the Pope what to do. No, but Our Lady of Fatima is telling him what to do. All I do is explain what it means. I answer the objections of theologians or others who haven't had the time to think about it. So when we get back to 1917, Our Lady comes. She comes and gives a message to show mankind the way to peace. She was asked, she was insisted that she come. She comes and she explains. And then for the next 95 years, we basically ignore her. So our Lord himself, in 1931, explained to the Pope and the bishops something, a lesson from history. He said, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like the King of France, they will follow him into misfortune. What is that example he's talking about, the King of France? On the 17th of June, to the very day, the 17th of June, 1689, our Lord spoke to St. Margaret Mary and told her to tell the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now the kings of France, there were 3 of them from that day, all ignored St. Margaret Mary's prophecy and our Lord's command through St. Margaret Mary. Even during her lifetime, St. Margaret Mary was known as a saint. She was well hidden, but her reputation for sanctity was well known among her contemporaries. And so, for them to ignore this, they paid with their lives. On the 17th of June, 1789, that's 100 years later to the day, the King of France was stripped of his authority by the Third Estate. 3 weeks later, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On the 20th or 21st of January, 1994, his head was cut off by the soldiers of the Revolution. And our Lord makes reference to this and says, "Make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like him, they will follow him into misfortune." Up until now, basically, the popes and the bishops around him have ignored, have delayed, have had one excuse after another. I think I've heard them all. And as we've had proven at these conferences before, none of those excuses really hold water. There is really no excuse for not doing it. However, that is not their choice up to now. And so we have a choice here. Of course, none of us are the Pope. None of us can command the Pope. Only he has the authority to command in the church himself or others, all the rest of the church. But we are not without resources. We will talk about this in another conference. But it's not just for the Pope. As the Pope himself, speaking at Fatima 2 years ago, said, what is foretold in the secret is the passion of the church. And yes, there's a persecution of the Pope, but the Pope is within the church. And so it's not just the Pope that suffers the passion coming up, but it is the church also.